Boom. We're live. Gentlemen, welcome back, and welcome Greg for the first time.
Hey, thank you. Happy to be on.
So today's book for discussion is The Ethics of Money Production by, I'm going to destroy this name, but Jorg Guido Hulsmann, I guess. Any corrections on that?
I think it's
Jorg. Jorg, yeah.
Jorg Guido.
And the book is The Ethics of Money Production. And I had not read this until recently, but I had heard it cited and recommended by a lot of people in the Bitcoin space. And because it was so good and because it touched on so many different aspects of understanding Bitcoin and economics and money, and just the title alone, I think, is, not provocative, but it's really compelling in terms of getting you to ask that question maybe for the first time, right? When I've talked about this book with a few friends in the days leading up to this discussion, and they're kind of, I get that weird look from them because it's not a concept that they ever thought about. Now, we know as Bitcoiners that anytime we talk about the history of money with friends, it's probably we get that kind of a look. But just to realize that there are ethics to the production of money, and then obviously by insinuation this book explores them, I think is really inviting to kind of expand your idea of the concept of money in the first place. Anyhow, so that's why I wanted to have this discussion about this book. Thought it was really good, but before we crack into it, why don't we just go around and get the intros? Al, we'll start with you.
All right, I am Al's Lacrosse on Twitter. Don't really look like my picture on Twitter. Probably best known for hosting Dirtbag Friday, which is a Zoom meetup every Friday evening, Friday afternoon, depending on where you are, where anybody can come together and just talk about Bitcoin.
Nice. Greg?
I meme on Twitter about Bitcoin. It's not a very long explanation about what I do.
Richard?
Hey guys, I'm Richard. I'm into Bitcoin and making films around Bitcoin and Austrian economics. I'm on Twitter, rjames_BTC. You can find the links there. One film called Hard Money and another one called Anatomy of the State, which is based on a book by Murray Rothbard, which has a lot of maybe has some parallels and has influenced Hulsmann a lot in his thinking. So that might be interesting to talk about as well.
Yeah, I think first, why don't we just go around and get first impressions? We'll get into the details and some of the major themes of the book as we go along. But Richard, why don't you get us kicked off with your kind of general impressions of this book?
I mean, it's a fantastic book. I read it some time ago. It was one of those books that I read when I was kind of building my, I was really getting interested in Austrian economics. And this is one of the, I think one of the really important modern contributions to Austrian monetary theory. And it might have been Stefan Lavera who turned me onto this. So hat tip to him for that. He's had Hulsmann on his podcast, and that's definitely worth listening to. And as you say, John, it's a topic that is like something from outer space for most people to think about money production in an ethical manner. So just for that reason alone, it's really valuable the way it explores that. I agree with everything in the book pretty much. I think it's fantastic the way it lays everything out very clearly. Particularly in the way it defines inflation. And I think Hulsmann's definition of inflation is the best definition that I've heard. And he says it's something like an increase in the supply of money over and of a particular type of money over and above what the free market alone would create. And I think that sets him up really well to go through a thorough analysis. There's some things in the book that I think will make for really interesting points to talk about. Like, it's obviously written in the 2008, so it's the year before Bitcoin, and he very much puts out the regression theory of money, saying that money has to be the only way money can come about on the free market is if it already has a commodity use, like a non-monetary use. It has to start from being useful for something else, so it can develop a price on the free market, so it can become money. So that is like an explanation. A lot of Austrian economists have led them to dismiss Bitcoin because it doesn't really have any other, or maybe we can argue about whether it has a non-monetary use or not. And he even says, there's a quote where he says something like, "It is unlikely that the internet can ever." It's quite an interesting quote because it's just before Bitcoin came out, and he says it's unlikely that the free market and the internet can ever produce a money, and I think he points towards the fact that information, can't inherently have a value. So I think that might be an interesting thing to dive into a bit more. But otherwise, and then the other interesting thing is like it's the book on the ethics of money production, but when he says ethics, like what does he mean by ethics? How does he define ethics? Like what is the system of ethics that he's actually going to use to make his judgments? And that's not a simple thing at all. So that could be another interesting thing to dive into. But yeah, I'm fully, it's a fantastic book in general.
Yeah. Greg?
I want to add on to the definition of inflation that I also found in the book. I made a note. He said inflation is the part of the money supply that comes into being because of the invasion of property rights. And it's a subtle invasion that all Bitcoiners, I think, know about. No, I really enjoyed the book. It was it's one of these guys that asks a question that you didn't know needed to be asked. Kind of like the fish swimming together in the water. Old fish goes by and says, "How's the water, boys?" And they look at each other and say, "Water?" Yeah. I looked at the title of the book. Is it Ethics of Money Production? What could be, before I got into Bitcoin, I guess the question would be what could be ethical or non-ethical about money production? It's just needs to be done. It's something that the government handles. And man, he went on a deep dive on the invasion of property rights and counterfeiting and defining, the government or non-government agencies doing money printing as a business. And you can apply business ethics to it. The TLDR of the book is that no, not ethical.
Al, what about you? What were your initial thoughts?
I wanted to touch on a couple of points that those guys made too, which we are so used to not questioning certain things because it's just been that way in our lifetime, in our parents' lifetime, and so on and so on. And money production is probably the mother of all those things. In terms of how pervasive it is and how much springs from it. And when you start reading into this, like all of these things which we take for granted, like, well, that's just how money works. It's just how it is. Well, that's how it works right now. That's not how it always did work or always has to work. So it's really eye-opening from that perspective. And a lot of the negatives of how it's working right now, you don't even think about because you're just so used to it, like the weather. Like, yeah, sometimes there's thunderstorms. That's just how it goes. But some of these things are actually man-made. They're not natural phenomena. I really liked how he was able to take somewhat esoteric concepts and really make it accessible to the layperson. For anybody who hasn't read the book, it's pretty heavily informed by Catholic philosophy, theology to a certain extent, but more Catholic philosophers going back to medieval and Renaissance era studies. But and you would think that would be really dry probably and not relevant to today, but he does a very good job of applying it and making it feel current. And really my strongest feeling on the book was how he opened up in his opening letter essentially with an argument that economics has to follow some sort of natural laws, as opposed to something where we can just conjure up any economic system and just have it work. The idea of the Austrians is that no, there is an inherent natural law to this, and you can't really screw with that any more than if you were an engineer or a physicist. You have to follow those rules when you're designing your system in order to make it work. That some of that there may be new truths and new principles that Bitcoin really opens up to the study of Austrian economics. I think that one about inherent properties, when we get into that, that's a big one right there. It's a big blind spot that everybody had because there just wasn't anything that fit a counterexample of that until now. But it's a great book, really fascinating stuff that we don't spend enough time thinking about.
Yeah, lots of great elements and aspects of the book mentioned. And, let's just jump into the deep end right away. Because he makes reference to this, Catholic, as you say, philosophy or kind of underpinnings, moral underpinnings. But he doesn't dig really into that. He just kind of almost in passing makes reference to just de facto that, those are good sort of principles that are being diluted or lost in the face of this unethical form of money production that is paper money. How did you guys feel about his kind of invocation of that aspect of morality or that approach to morality in this book?
I think it was fair. He also made use of the example of in the Bible where they mess with weights and measures. Really, the only time Jesus freaks out in the Bible and goes off on people. I think they also made mention of that was the reason he got crucified. He was calling himself a king and possibly collecting taxes. Am I remembering that correctly?
I think so. I'm not the best to ask about that.
The wrong person.
Yeah. The whole time, to go back to Al's point about the money stemming from natural law, I just kept thinking about the point Breedlove was making about money either going with or against the thermodynamic arrow of time. Like so much of our best money creations fit within the laws of thermodynamics. Gold stays gold forever, right? Can't create it, can't transmute it. And Bitcoin is gold, but 1,000 times better. So, it fits within the natural law that he's talking about.
The natural law thing is interesting. And I think, I would have liked to see this kind of Catholic frame. A thing that he discusses. I maybe would have liked to see more of a framework built around how he was going to use that, as I said. But because he's sort of like, he goes back and forth between, talking about the Bible or talking about these old scholars or talking about Austrian libertarian ethics, and sort of he kind of uses them all here or there, and it is kind of like they are all linked, like this scholastic tradition of like Thomas Aquinas and this guy Nicholas Oresme, who he quotes quite a lot. Like they are that kind of scholastic tradition was sort of an attempt to reconcile Christianity with science or with the use of reason and logic, and it kind of set up this process of thinking which is based on the use of reason and deduction. Like it's the opposite of what we in modern times call empiricism. It's just like following a process of logic, and that and using that process using reason to discover these natural laws or this natural ethical system. And that is a tradition that's like the modern kind of political philosophers like Rothbard or Hulsmann are kind of building on that same framework. Like that's Mises, with human action. That's the framework that they use to make their arguments. So I think it does all fit together quite well.
Talking about what Al was saying about how we'll probably approach these subjects with at least a different perspective, if not a whole new sort of, approach to them as a science. Do you think moving forward in a Bitcoin world, we continue to invoke kind of those moral, historical, philosophical underpinnings represented in the Catholic teachings and history, or is that something that we, I hesitate to use the term no longer need, but will it be relevant in a Bitcoin world?
I think there's a universal quality there. It's something to remember too when he's invoking a lot of Catholic teaching. I think a certain amount of it is probably his own connection to the church. But we've got to remember too that if you're reaching back in time, and he's doing this from a European perspective, looking at money before it was nation state money, as we know. Academia and the church were kind of one and the same, especially in the medieval period. If you were a man of letters, you were probably a monk or a priest or something like that. So the fact that he's citing all of these Catholic thinkers, well, those were the professors and philosophers of their time in that era. So while I don't think it's just completely coincidence, I do think he has some religious belief behind it. He's invoking the people who were the thinkers about this stuff of that era. They were almost by definition universally in some way church affiliated. So I think that's a big thing. But there is a universality of this idea of right and wrong and morals, and that's one of the biggest arguments for Bitcoin, right? I think for those of us in the maximalist community anyway, it's like, yeah, transactions around the world, that's all cool, but the kind of stuff that really, really interests us is tearing down corrupt systems and putting into place things that are much more fair and more moral systems. So that we're going to carry that at least for a generation or two as Bitcoiners.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just reading a passage where one of the topics he brings up, and it's one we talk a lot about in Bitcoin, is the influence that paper money system has on the individual and has on the state. And one of those relationships is just increasing the size and services provided by the state, and thereby disincentivizing the individual to be self-reliant. And this has many downstream effects on the family and on behavior and on risk-taking. And I thought, yeah, again, like when I was reading this book, because I think if you are in Bitcoin long enough, you're at least around these people are bringing these arguments to your attention so much on Twitter or elsewhere that you've already come across them. And now to read this book, I was kind of tickled sometimes to think like, oh, this is where a lot of these probably came from, because he makes so many of those, he elucidates so many of those relationships that emerge as a result of a paper money system. But the kind of insidious effects on the size of the state because of the paper money, because of the ability for them to use paper money to siphon off the wealth of the citizens they govern, and the impacts that has on both family and individual behavior. I think that would be an interesting one to dig into now if anyone's got some thoughts on. Not all at once.
I think you can see when you read Seyfedin's work, you can see some of Hulsmann's influence on the moral aspects and the influence that this kind of money creation has on society as a whole. You get this sort of the state on the one side and the family on the other side. And the family, you get accused of being a conspiracy theorist when you talk about the state attacking the family, but there's definitely something to that because I think the nuclear family, if you put aside moral or ethical or religious kind of analyses of the family unit and look at it purely in an economic sense. And the one person who's written on this in a way that I find fascinating is Hopper. Hans Hermann Hopper discusses in an anthropological sense or a historical sense, the development of the family unit motivated by economics. And there was a transition from humans living in bands more like chimpanzees or whatever, where you've got a few dominant males who are the ones who do all the procreation, and eventually there was a move towards but then in that situation the costs of having additional children can be socialized amongst the whole group, whereas this move towards a family unit with a single mother and a father that internalized the cost of having children on the actual parents, and so that turned out to be a more efficient way to organize society and to push them past, to push human civilization past this kind of Malthusian limit. And so the family unit has been a really important driving force in the progress of human civilization in an economic sense. And I think civilization and economics are intrinsically linked. And so if the framework I always like to put it on is this social power versus state power, like looking at history as a race between the power of the state versus the power of free voluntary society. And I think that one of the state's I guess, tactics in whatever form the state takes, whether it's a king or a democracy or a socialist government, is to attack the family unit, because the family unit is a center of economic power and social power that is external to the state. So the more that the state can break down that family unit and usurp the functions of the family unit, that allows the state to increase its power. So that's why you see them trying to break down, they're taking away education. They want to take away aged care, as many social services as they can to break down that power of the family unit.
Yeah.
We also want to take over the social services to break the power of the family unit. So, you're not relying on your family for healthcare and childcare and the jobs that a family business might provide. You want to end up relying on the state.
What's up, Corey?
Yeah, it's creating dependency. Exactly.
Yeah, it's creating dependence.
Yeah, I think, one of the points he makes in this book is, there may be those sorts of agendas by governments all over the world, and perhaps all of them. That's certainly an argument to have. But I think one of the points that he makes is that it's inevitable when this type of disparity in power exists. When one entity has the ability to effectively issue paper money to monopolize the production of currency, this is the type of relationship that inevitably exists. And just as a simple kind of, it's not hard to imagine why, right? If family has limited resources to provide whatever the things in terms of support that they're meant to provide to each other, and this other entity outside of them has limitless resources to attempt to compete to provide those supports, then at some point that entity is going to provide those supports better or more capably or more all-encompassingly than the family unit, or at the very least, unless the family unit is incredibly strong, right? And I think today in society we're seeing a lot of examples of not only, the family is probably under stress for other reasons as well, but I think this culture of this Leviathan state hanging in the background or the forefront that's, implicitly saying we will take care of all of these different responsibilities that the family unit may have had previously, and therefore the individuals within those families are less tied to the family unit for the support that they desire or need. And that causes obviously a change in their behavior away from one conducive to a strong family. I think something like that.
Yeah, they're doing that while simultaneously distorting the value mechanism tool.
Right.
I think you give it in the right order too, though, which is it may be whatever the agenda is follows upon the human nature aspect of it, which is to centralize that power and authority. It's not the other way around. It's you centralize that power or give yourselves more power, and then you keep coming up with reasons why you need to do that and why it's important. But he's as far as you were talking, the original question I think was about the way he addresses the morality. He doesn't mince words too, where he uses the term counterfeiting throughout the book in a way which it's not a couple of guys in ski masks writing out fake dollar bills like from a cartoon or something. He's referring to that as counterfeiting, but also to printing money without an increase in reserves behind that money. That is inherently counterfeit. And it seems like such a loaded term, but he's correct to do so. I mean, that's what's really going on. We just don't call it that. So you're counterfeiting value. While you may legally have the right to print that paper, the value that it represents is counterfeit value.
Yeah, I just want to read this passage from the book, but he says, a cursory glance at the historical record shows that the exponential growth of the welfare state, which in Europe started in the early 1970s, went hand in hand with the explosion of public debt. It is widely known that this development has been a major factor in the decline of the family, but it is commonly overlooked that the ultimate cause of this decline is fiat inflation. Perennial inflation slowly but assuredly destroys the family, thus suffocating the earthly flame of morals, to your point, Al. And then he goes on to say, the fact is that libertine lifestyles carry, and this, obviously his judgment comes in here, but I think it's an easy one to argue. The fact is that libertine lifestyles carry great economic risks. The welfare state socializes the costs of morally reckless behavior and therefore gives it a far greater prominence than it would have in a free society. The welfare state systematically exposes people to the temptation of believing that there are no time-tested moral precepts at all. And I'll just, one more paragraph. Let us emphasize that the point of the preceding observations was not to attack welfare services, which are in fact an essential component of society. Neither is it here our intention to attack the notion that welfare services should be provided through the government. The point is, rather, that the fiat inflation destroys the democratic control over the provision of these services, that this invariably leads to excessive growth of the aggregate welfare system and to excessive forms of welfare, and that this in turn is not without consequences for the moral and spiritual character of the population. But and the final point is that fiat inflation is a juggernaut of social, economic, cultural, and spiritual destruction. There you go.
What stuff?
Well, tying that back into the topic you were hitting just before, because John, you were kind of comparing, and by the way, good to see all you guys. I think I've
you too, buddy.
Talked with all of you on a podcast except for one of you, so it's good to see you again. You were sort of comparing what a family can do for itself versus what the government can do with limitless resources, but it's not even a fair comparison. And I think that's what the passage that you just hit really makes incredibly clear, because you are simultaneously, while gathering more power in the centralized entity, you're also just absolutely destroying and inflating away the power of the family to provide for itself, or for small communities to provide for themselves, because you're essentially taxing through inflation and sort of ripping away the foundations of sort of how we evolved as humans and as societies and families, et cetera. So yeah, it's absolutely not a fair fight. It's a totally fixed game. I think that's what I take away from that passage.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Yeah, they're siphoning the power away through inflation. It's a violation of the property rights of the families that are having that value stolen from them. Nobody asked them if that was a tax they'd be willing to bear, and the state just does it at the barrel of a gun.
It might be worth that. I agree 100% with all that, and it might be worth digging in a bit deeper to the mechanism by which he actually defines inflation or how inflation is actually an invasion of people's property rights, because that's not an intuitive thing to understand at all. So I think that might be something interesting to discuss. And
yeah, let's do it, because it's pretty much the foundation of the book upon which everything else is predicated, and we didn't really give it its proper due. So go for it.
Yeah. So he builds up to the main point being that the most important aspect of all this is the legal tender laws that force people to use one form of money over another. He said that without the legal tender laws, nothing else is actually that important. Like the fact that the state counterfeits money. Well, that's been happening since the beginning of states, and as long as people have a free alternative available to them, then they can just go to that. But it's the forcing one upon them through a legal tender law. So that is where the infringement of property rights occurs, where the state says you must, say I own gold and I want to make a transaction denominated in gold. The state will say, no, you're not allowed to use your gold in that manner. You have to use our paper notes, or if you're going to hold that gold, we will put a capital gains tax on that. So, it's interesting the way he talks about counterfeiting, and he's actually not as critical. He obviously says counterfeiting is wrong in whatever moral framework that you apply to it because it's basically a type of fraud. But he says that, and that counterfeiting will occur on the free market if we just allow anyone, and if we allow free for all, when anyone can create whatever money and use whatever money that they want, we will have people trying to counterfeit money, whether that is debasing coins or whether it's circulating certificates to a base money that doesn't exist. But and unfortunately, individuals will get deceived and hurt by that, but that it's not systemic. There's an anti-fragility to that system because people are hyper vigilant to it, and whenever there's an attack on the system, it has a way to self-correct. Whereas the legal tender laws is like a structural, gives this legitimacy to the theft, and that's where the problem really arises. And it's a historical pattern that repeats itself. It's not that's the other thing that's interesting. It's not that the state can't just impose a worthless paper ticket and apply a legal tender law and say use this. That doesn't work. It has to be a historical process where the first thing they do, and you see it over and over, they impose this bimetallism. So they peg the price at usually gold and silver, and then that, under Gresham's law, that drives out one of the two. Often it's driven out silver. Then you get a monopoly on the gold production. That becomes centralized. Then you get the legal tender law, the paper certificates that are expanded beyond the base money, and then you sever the link so you can no longer redeem the paper for the precious metal. And the fiat money has kind of followed that path in pretty much every instance, and that's how it came to be today.
Yeah, and I think to your point about this not being intuitive, the thing I find funny that I've brought up in conversations recently with friends is most people have at least an awareness of inflation. Stuff gets more expensive. Candy bar was 5 cents when our parents were around, and now they're $1 or $1.50 or whatever. So people get it, that prices go up, and they may even understand that it's a loss of purchasing power from their perspective. But so few people realize that it's more accurately described as a transfer of purchasing power, right? So yes, you lost it, but it didn't just evaporate into the ether. It was taken from you, and somebody else gained purchasing power from that loss of yours. And I think if that was more understood, there'd be a lot more pushback to how this system works and how this process unfolds. But of course, there's not much. It obviously doesn't get much airtime because it would make the whole process even more damning than it is. But I there's one passage here that I'll just read out. And it's talking about inflation, but it says the prince, going back to a bygone era, has the right to make a simple alteration to the coin and draw some profit from it. He must also have the right to make a greater alteration and draw more profit, and to do this more than once and make still more. And it is probable that he or his successors would go on doing this either of their own motion or by the advice of their counsel as soon as this was permitted, because human nature is inclined and prone to heap up riches when it can do so with ease. And so the prince would be at length able to draw to himself almost all the money or riches of his subjects and reduce them to slavery. And this would be tyrannical, indeed true and absolute tyranny, as it is represented by philosophers and in ancient history. One wonders what this great mind might have said about the monetary institutions of our time. Already in his day, Oresme stated that institutionalized inflation, as it can only exist under the protection of government, turns such a government into a tyrant. And this tyranny becomes perfect if the government can enshrine inflation into law. And I bring that up just because lately, we've seen Jay Powell on the TV talking about trying to hit a CPI inflation. And again, there's a distinction there that should be made, but is over most people's heads, where that's a mandate, so that's exactly what he was just talking about in this book. And basically that, the time scale is the only thing really that's up for debate. The inevitable outcome is quite clear, and there's many historical precedents. And so that's one of the values of this book is it brings that to light for people that maybe previously didn't consider things in that way.
Lowers the reader's time preference.
He also, the book's not very heavy on math, but he does get into numbers at a couple of parts where he's talking about ways in which those princes of that era debased the currency, and puts a number on it, basically how much they're doing that, and then compares it to now, what central banks have done. And keep in mind, this came out in 2008, so these numbers are nothing compared to what we're looking at now, but it's extraordinary. I mean, eras of, say, coin clipping, debasing metal coins, which we'd look at and say, oh, yeah, they went way overboard. That's crazy. They were nothing compared to what's going on now. So it's kind of chilling when you read that.
Yeah, it's like he says, so it's like from 1100 to 1600 in England. So a 500-year period, they debased the coinage by 0.3 or something, so 30% over 500 years. And yet this year, the monetary base has inflated like 23% or something. So in 1 year, we've basically had the equivalent of 500 years worth of inflation of the kind that they were criticizing. And the amazing thing is that those passages by Oresme pretty much sum up everything that we could possibly put in an argument against inflation. Like, as in, he already figured it out in the 14th century. Like he says, to your point, John, like he says, the prince's gain must inevitably come at the community's loss. Talking about changes to the coinage. So that's sort of the Cantillon effect and the redistribution effect that we talk about. Like, it's a zero-sum game and only has negative consequences. And it had been none of this is new. It had been figured out 600 years ago.
Yeah, it's not like we're just discovering these problems.
Yeah. But, it's interesting. He doesn't mention hyperinflation that often, and I think he only mentions seigniorage once. And one of the ways that he refers to, and he's writing in 2008, so things are probably pretty fresh in his mind. And I'd love to hear what his perspective on things are today, although I can expect what they would be. But he's one of the things he says about seeing hyperinflation in the West, in particular in the U.S., is two things. One, he says, when the foreigners stop buying our dollars, that's when we'll really see the impacts of all this money printing. And I know there's, the debt components of all that, and there's a few other factors. And then he says, the U.S. has convinced the other countries to dollarize, either directly or indirectly, by sharing the seigniorage with them. So by sharing the benefits of that. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that process unfolds, how that seigniorage is shared. If any of you have insight on that, I'd love to hear it. But, it is one of the big questions today. It's like, how long can this persist? And I wonder, with, moves toward different forms of currency, even from the central bank and government level, as incompetent and slow to be developed as they may be, will that cause a de-dollarization of the world? And will that be the impetus for, a hyperinflation in places like the U.S.? And, if the U.S. hyperinflates, I got to assume most other paper currencies around the world as well will as well. So what were your guys' thoughts on those points that he mentioned in the book?
Well, with sharing seigniorage, a pretty clear example is like the Eurodollar. That's not redeemable anywhere outside of the Eurozone, right? So if the Fed's got swap lines to European banks with Eurodollars going out, but they can't come back, any loans made in those denominations go straight to those banks closest to the money spigot, essentially. That would be sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with the sharing seigniorage thing, I agree with what Greg said, and also he uses the analogy of like a pyramid. So if you isolate just a single country, the way it works is you've got your base layer, which is at the base of the pyramid, gold, or actually it's more like an inverted pyramid because it gets bigger. So the gold's at the bottom, the central bank holds the gold and issues bank reserves to the commercial banks. So the bank reserves of the central bank are the next layer. Then the commercial banks use the bank reserves and lend out as a multiple on top of that. So you get this ever expanding amount of credit. And he says that And that system always has a centralizing tendency because it allows for more inflation at each level. And he says that plays out on an international scale as well. So with the United States as the base, so like all the gold in the world got pretty much sucked into the United States, and that was a historical accident of the world wars. Then so it came to be that the US and the Fed became the kind of central bank of the world. They export their US dollars to the rest of the world, and most of the other central banks, instead of holding gold as their main reserve, they actually hold US dollars, and they then inflate credit based on the US dollars. So these other countries are like the higher level of the pyramid. And Hulsmann says that the way that works is it restricts the United States in a certain extent. Like the lower you are down in the pyramid, the less you can inflate. It actually puts a brake on you. So the countries that use the US dollar as a reserve asset can actually inflate at a higher and get away with it at a higher percentage than the US dollar. But that's offset by political power. So the US makes that trade. Like it wants countries to dollarize and accepts the fact that it limits the US to some extent in their ability to inflate because it gives them the political power over those countries, like a modern empire building.
So do you guys think that, this central bank digital currency push from central banks outside the US is an attempt to de-dollarize? Because a lot of people in the world, a lot of governments and institutions probably want that. It's just a precarious, you got to be careful with how you do it. It's a very precarious situation. Is that part of the motivation you think is behind all that?
I would think in the short term, it's more surveillance and control motivated for most countries because it gives you this incredible panopticon. I think China would love to de-dollarize the world at some point. I don't know if they're really in the middle of trying to take on that project right now. Russia probably too, but they don't really have the juice to do that on their own. That is one way that they could start. I just think they're going to be too late. It's not going to be their central bank's digital currency. If that happens, it's going to be Bitcoin. But that's my humble opinion about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, kind of building on that, I'd say China would like to see anybody and everybody get onto anything other than the dollar. And if it's a digital yuan of some sort or just the yuan as it is, pre-CBDC, then they'd love that too, just as long as it moves away from the dollar and kind of provides a counterbalance. The European countries and sort of the participants in kind of the IMF or, global world order, Western order, whatever, that are sort of sick of the dollar underpinning everything. I just see them kind of flirting with the CBDCs a little bit more as probably a bargaining chip and saying like, hey, there's this thing we can do. And I suspect it will probably end up with, monetary negotiations and trade negotiations and all kinds of other things between the US and the EU and whoever else actually can garner a seat at the table to matter in that sort of negotiation. But, thinking about the EU actually pulling off a functioning, central bank digital currency seems rather unlikely. I also think that even in the UK, where they do seem like they're sliding down this slippery slope toward panopticon or whatever, I think there are still enough sort of free thinking children of the Enlightenment in the UK to kind of try to head that off. The bad guys in too many sci-fi movies have been British. I feel like they have one more fight in them and can probably avoid it. I think, I'm fairly optimistic that the UK can avoid becoming Big Brother, before Bitcoin is large enough to sort of do what it's going to do. So hopefully that's the case. I really think the whole Western world is going to avoid the scariest of the sci-fi scenarios with regards to, a panopticon through the money supply. I hope so, fighting for it, but we need Bitcoin soon.
Yeah, exactly. This discussion makes me think about because he brings up the gold standard a couple times in the book. He doesn't dig into it too much, but he's not all that. He doesn't subscribe to the opinion that it was cracked up to be. And I often think about when we're talking about central bank digital currencies and Bitcoin and the game theory around this, surely it's got to be in the best interest of a lot of countries, even though they would relinquish the control of, let's say, currency issuance and the tracking abilities that they would have on their citizens and spending and stuff if they adopted Bitcoin. But if they really think, like, I take someone like China, and I know this may be contentious, but let's just go with the narrative that China is, incredibly productive country. They manufacture everything. They can compete well on a global stage. Let's just assume that for now, and we can dig into the merits of that assumption if you want. But from the perspective of a global player like that, and relating it back to how everyone adopted gold in let's say the late 1800s, and in this book, he suggests that it was done on an international level organically. Why wouldn't those countries want to adopt something like Bitcoin just so that they can be playing on a fair, on a fair playing field, and let the merits of their country's capacity and prowess, the merits of that be revealed and the benefits accrue, rather than everyone, doing basically the same thing that we've done with paper money, but with a CBDC.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. With the CBDC, it's like in terms of countries adopting a Bitcoin standard, I find that the game theory behind that I find fascinating, and I want to come back to that. I think the other thing about the central bank digital currencies, I think that the other issue at play, like obviously there's the surveillance, panopticon thing. There's also the global power struggle about which currency is the reserve currency. But my personal opinion is that the central banks are pushing the digital currency right now more from a purely economic sense, in that it'll give them finer control over things like inflation or their national economies. Like, because at the moment you're seeing them pump up the base money and the bank reserves, but the commercial banks are the ones that actually increase the usable money supply in the economy, and the banks aren't lending. They're getting rid of reserve requirements, getting rid of whatever, but they can't get the banks to lend this money into the existence to get the inflation that they want. But if they can bypass the commercial banks and just airdrop this currency directly to the citizens will then spend, and that will create that nominal GDP growth that they're looking for. So I think it's a combination of all those things. And then, I don't actually have a good answer about countries going on a Bitcoin standard. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits to that for your, and I think obviously it would make sense for countries to be buying Bitcoin right now. But the other thing is, the competitive devaluations that all the countries around the world are engaged in right now, trying to make your economy more competitive, to boost your exports, like that's such a powerful game that everyone's playing, that I know I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm interested in what people have to think about. And I heard Jeff Booth talking about this, about one of the problems with countries, or small countries, going on a Bitcoin standard is that, if people are only willing to work for a certain amount of Bitcoin, like, it means that it's good and that living standards can potentially rise, or real wages can rise, but whether that makes your country uncompetitive on a global scale, I find that interesting. I don't really know the answer to that.
But it's like he makes a point often in the book. It's like inflation doesn't bring any new resources into existence, right? It just reallocates them. So like all these countries, like I get the allure of one, enrich, if you're at the helm of the governmental structures in these countries, I mean, that's probably what it's mostly about, because being at the top of that gives you the power to enrich yourself and enrich your cronies and be basically a king in the world. Because just using that to try to compete with other countries based on your, how witty you can be in your selective devaluation and the timing of your devaluation of the currency to make whatever your resources are more competitive on the global market. I mean, you got to be able to see that as being incredibly short term And what are you going to outsmart 200 different countries on a global stage through that process? Like, doesn't it just make more sense from a purely competitive point of view to just all be competing, on the same field? So I think it's probably, and he makes allusions to this frequently throughout the book, just kind of the tyrannical, the trend towards tyranny that such a system of fiat paper money inspires. And I think the reason why it persists is because it benefits the people that are at the top of it. That's probably why. I mean, we're trying to make sense of something here that doesn't make any sense, right?
On the topic of CBDCs, he touches on it a little bit. Obviously, he doesn't call them that. On my copy, it's the bottom of page 37 in the money certificates chapter. But he speaks about how it's an advantage to have multiple people issuing their own coinage, and even if some of them are abusing their trust and debasing their currency, it's actually a good thing because it's educational for everyone. Helps them to kind of understand things a little bit better. And I'm wondering if central bank digital currencies might be that, where we talk about them kind of in the same breath as Bitcoin just because they're a digital money, but obviously, anyone on this call knows there's a huge difference. It may be useful to the public to see that, because the narrative is going to be, oh, this is our Bitcoin. Like we made our own Bitcoin. And it's not going to be long until people, number go up is a bitch with that. Like, people are going to notice that things are happening with Bitcoin that are not happening with these CBDCs. So they may do us a favor in the long run doing that, because they're gonna give everybody I would say a free lesson. It's not going to be free, but a lesson we're not going to be paying for ourselves on why Bitcoin is better money.
I think that's 100% right.
Cash and Bitcoin SV and Litecoin.
Yeah, I mean, by definition, it's just going to make people question the nature of money way more than they ever have before. Just like really the last few days, have caused at least some small percentage of people to say, like, what the heck was Bretton Woods? What is this thing? What are you talking about? What is this new deal for the international monetary system? Oh, wait, what is money? Wait, what's this Bitcoin thing? It just happens. I think it happened last summer with all the noise with Libra and the Libra hearings. That brought a lot of people into Bitcoin, got a lot of people interested, got people starting companies, got people joining companies. It helped some people start down the rabbit hole. It's just bound to happen that way. Just one note on, CBDCs with regards to the US and the potential for a Fed coin. I think we're starting to get pretty clear signals that that's not in the offing, not something that the government thinks could be taken on, nor would be taken on, nor would be desirable to be taken on. We saw a couple of weeks ago, Brian Brooks got interviewed at a blockchain conference and said he doesn't see that coming ever or anytime soon, and that the US would be much more likely just to create a framework and let people digitize the dollar. Essentially, just let GUSD and Tether and USDC and whoever else wants to digitize dollars or have digital representations of dollars in the existing system just go forward. That's how I see that going. And then, kind of just to extend it further and bring it back to Bitcoin, I think the advantages that the US has, just geographically, demographically, culturally, whatever, entrepreneurship, all those different things, and just historically, if the playing field were fair, the US would be just fine. And I think that's going to become more and more clear to people in the US government over time, and will just be like another argument that people will make more and more eloquently and will write about, and we'll start to see becoming true. You're seeing US companies, pile into Bitcoin, PayPal today. I just got a note from one of our investors saying, whisper is that PayPal will, buy some custodian for $1 billion soon, so they're probably going to go full whole hog and not just do the Robinhood thing. I just think it's going to spread so far, so fast through the American companies that, they'll build out Bitcoin infrastructure so fast. It's going to make our heads spin over the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think we're going to blink and open our eyes one day and we're going to be like, oh my God, we're here. Like, how did that happen overnight? You know, it's the old gradually then suddenly saying.
Yeah, I agree. But do you guys think, you know, it's been really smooth sailing. Do you still think, you know, along this line of discussion about, you know, government's plans and their attempts to maintain their control and, you know, this gravy train that they're at the helm of, do you think it's, you know, going to be contentious, like really contentious, or as Corey was just saying, and as I know we've all been paying very close attention to this, we just see, you know, further and more rapid integration and adoption with, you know, the big companies, the big financial institutions and other institutions of our society. And it just becomes so, you know, normal that, yeah, exactly.
I think Corey's wrong. I don't think CBDCs are gonna be okay with the tethers and the USDCs of the world. I think everything's trending to a digital coin, central bank derived.
That's specifically U.S., by the way.
Specifically U.S. Okay.
That's U.S. only, yeah. So Brian Brooks was the former Coinbase guy that's now acting comptroller of the currency in the U.S., and that's his view. And I think you probably got enough. If you had that in mind and then you listened to Powell on the panel the other day, I think you got enough hints that that's probably the approach for the U.S. Not that I think there's consensus. I mean, there's people having all kinds of conversations that aren't necessarily talking to each other, but it would be hard for me to see the U.S. taking on that project, and if so, doing it well.
And, you know, just to make another distinction between gold and Bitcoin and dunk on the gold bugs a bit, because in the book, the passage reads, referring to the gold standard, its ultimate effect was not to give the citizens of the world an efficient monetary system, but to deliver a pretext for national governments to finally bring the monetary systems of their countries under their control. The classical gold standard was therefore hardly a bulwark of liberty. It was a crucial breakthrough for the societal scourge of our age, government omnipotence. Now, I know the gold bugs would freak out at something like that because, you know, gold is the savior of everything. But I think that's a big distinction, you know, and so maybe they were willing to adopt that, you know, better form of money because of what they were able to do as a result of adopting it, the control that it ultimately gave them, and then the little bait and switch that they did on everybody versus something like Bitcoin. So, you know, it remains to be seen if they'll willingly adopt Bitcoin if it becomes so big and so ingrained that they can't ignore it. But I guess we'll see.
The point about why countries in the 19th century adopted gold that Hulsmann makes is really interesting, and it's something I hadn't considered before. You know, you sort of assume that, okay, that they were more enlightened in terms of they were adopting gold because it was sound money. But yeah, it's a really good point he makes that it's more likely that they were adopting gold because of its centralizing tendencies and because it was a step on the road to greater control of their country's money supply. And he makes this really interesting point that, you know, a government monopoly on a certain kind of money production is inflationary in one sense, but it's also deflationary in another sense because it drives out all the other monies that people would have used otherwise before there was a monopoly. So you see that with the demonetization of silver. Like I'm conditioned to think of silver in a really negative light. You know, Saifedean says, "Oh, silver is a shit coin." It's can't compete gold for stock to flow. You know, it's not a good store of value. But Hulsmann makes this really good case for silver. Like he says, silver is kind of like the money of the people. Like because it is can be used in very small transactions, people are more likely to physically transact in it, and they're more likely to hold it. So it empowers individuals to hold onto their money. Whereas because gold is not practical to use in a small transaction, it gets held in bank vaults, which then gets exploited through inflation. So I find that was a really interesting argument that he didn't that I hadn't really considered before.
He was making the argument that it was more than just gold and silver too. I think he brought copper into the.
Yeah,
No real reason you couldn't have more than one.
Yeah, well, he was very much in the camp of, free market for money sort of thing. And I got the impression that he wasn't so adamant that the market would coalesce on one dominant money, but that there may be multiple monies in use. And actually, I want to touch on this, a couple more points, at least from my side. But the commodity theory of money, he invokes that in the book, and basically saying, money first has to have a real world, basically consumable use case. And being in Bitcoin, and this is one of the stumbling blocks for people to understand Bitcoin, and one of the criticisms, or at least attempted criticisms, that it often gets. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on why it's not necessarily, the regression theorem is not necessary. Money doesn't have to regress back to some form of commodity or use value.
If I could jump in here, because I was talking about that early on. I think that may be, one of the ways in which Bitcoin sort of makes Austrian economics mature into a new iteration. Because you hear that constantly, this idea of, well, what is the intrinsic value? We all know Peter Schiff has kind of died on that hill. What is the intrinsic value? The intrinsic value, and what it really comes down to is you're asking, okay, what does this stuff do? Whether it be cows or metals or whatever you're trading, ultimately at some level it starts off with the idea of what does this stuff do. And it's a false belief, this idea, well, Bitcoin doesn't do anything because it doesn't have any physical properties. What Bitcoin does is Bitcoin has unforgeable scarcity, and that's what it does. It does do something. That's what it does. And that, more so than its electrical conductivity or malleability or how its luster and jewelry, all these things that gold has, that is a more important property for something that's going to be a monetary asset than any of that. And it's just, we never thought of it before because it never existed. And this is a case of sort of reality, sort of backfilling theory a little bit here. But that's what Bitcoin does. It's digital scarcity, and nothing else does that. So that's a property.
It also is a way that it transmutes electrical work into mathematical value. It's a math battery. It stores that mathematical value through time indefinitely without loss.
Yeah, I've often wondered. Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
No. I was just gonna say I agree with Greg. Like, I agree with both of you guys that it almost doesn't matter, because. And I think the obvious answer is that the regression theorem is obviously a theory that can explain how money comes into being, but is not the only way that money can come into being. But we also just have to accept the fact that, all of us here view Bitcoin as money and use Bitcoin as money, so it is money. So there must kind of be, it has a value, so there must be an explanation for it. And Austrians also say that value is subjective. So in terms of, that makes it thorniest to actually explain what is a use case. Like, maybe I just value Bitcoin purely for the elegance of the cryptography or something like that. And so I think a good reference here is Szabo's shelling out article. I think his explanation of the origins of money is, I personally think it's a much better explanation than anything you read. It's different to the regression theorem, and he talks about useless items becoming valuable, like these collectibles, these shells, these carved necklaces. They literally have no utility, but through this curiosity, that they gained a monetary value, and as Al said, it's because of this unforgeable costliness. Like, that is the thing. So yeah, I think there is a strong case to say that Bitcoin invalidates the regression theorem a little bit. This idea that you have to go back to barter. But Szabo, in shelling out, I think laid out a theory that this was before the time of Bitcoin, and I think he laid out a theory of the origin of money that perfectly can incorporate things like Bitcoin, which is why I think his explanation of the origins of money is the best.
Yeah.
He also said that the fact that an item doesn't have any utility increases its monetary value.
Well, that's just the point, right? This is the part that I always found peculiar is, they would talk about its like use value or its consumable value, and then its monetary premium, whether it's gold or salt or whatever. And it's always like, well, sure. So you've just divided it. You've divided it into its consumption value, and you've said it's valued for its monetary premium. Where it does the value? Why do people value it for that monetary premium? Well, they're valuing it that way because of its attributes and properties that can allow them to use it as money. And we don't have to get into all those here, but I feel like I don't know why the leap is so difficult when something like Bitcoin comes up to call it a pure monetary premium, like it's all monetary premium. And why is that any fundamental? Like, why is that a fundamental distinction between something that's 90% monetary premium and 10% consumption, or use demand? Like, you're just taking something and based on its properties, deciding that it's useful for something. Bitcoin is incredibly useful for money based on its properties.
And the gold bugs understand this too, which, and the way you can tell is, they contradict themselves because, and again, I'll pick on Schiff because he's the biggest name of this, who's always mixing it up with Bitcoiners. But when he's talking about, inherent value and all that, when gold was on a run up in, what was it, 2009, 2010, was he touting gold saying, look, we've discovered all of these new uses and properties of gold, and that's why it's worth so much more? No, he's touting its monetary value as a hedge against inflated currency. So why is gold suddenly worth more? It didn't suddenly get all these new properties, but he doesn't care about that, right? He cares about its unforgeable scarcity property. Yet somehow when you want to transfer that to Bitcoin, it's like, oh no, that doesn't count. Like, it's silly. It's just a matter of being too used to this never existing before, so it's hard to wrap your mind around it, or maybe having incentives not to do so.
Yeah, for him, incentives.
Yeah, definitely. But I'm a little bit less hard on that type of thinking, just because this is the first time we've ever had a pure monetary asset, right? So, okay, it's a bit of a paradigm shift, but again, I don't see why there's a fundamental distinction about how you price a monetary premium. It's the same. It's just that this is all monetary premium.
If you listen to Hulsmann,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I just quickly say that you have to give him credit that in recent interviews he's very open to Bitcoin, and he said that he sees no reason why Bitcoin couldn't become money. So he's not a full-on Bitcoin advocate, but he hasn't let that stop him from being open to Bitcoin. So at least he's open to that.
Yeah, I'm just picking on him as a figurehead, really. It's not him in particular.
Oh, the Schiff has no hope.
I'm just going to give a quick shout out to Connor Brown, because he did that piece last year. I think it was like May of 19. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, and that's great. And it was like super short, super to the point, and made the point really, really clearly. So I loved that one. And I think Guy did a readout of it on Bitcoin Audible as well. So you can go find that.
Yeah, that was a great piece. And I think, for a lot of people, eye-opening, just that this can even be possible, especially for people that ascribe to, whether it's, mostly the Austrian kind of theory of money, because anyone ascribing to the state theory of money, they're probably already lost.
They're not too good.
Another one of the last things I wanted to touch on from the book was interest rates. This is something that I feel like, again, doesn't get that much press. Obviously, there's good reasons for that, but it's even more kind of buried down the list of, financial fuckery that's going on under the current system. And, again, people get inflation to a certain degree. It hurts their wallet and they get it, but very few people, entrepreneurs more so, but even them have a very probably poor appreciation for the role of interest rates, what should be setting interest rates, and what disparities or intervention in the free market setting of interest rates has on, the economic calculation that's done in an economy, and thus the ability for it to succeed and avoid, kind of boom bust cycles, and the detrimental impacts and facilitation of boom bust cycles that a central bank setting interest rates has. So anybody have particular thoughts on that one?
he lays out a good, like the early part of the book is Hulsmann lays out the case that modern sort of neo-Keynesian economics makes for controlling the money supply. And he says that, this, and this will come to interest rates. Like he says, it's because if you read a modern economics textbook, it'll say it's great that we can produce paper money and gold is archaic because we're not wasting money digging it out of the ground. We can increase the money supply in line with GDP growth and the growth of global trade, and we can also change the money supply to stabilize the price level. And they're all like, Hulsmann just destroys all those arguments as to why you need to be able to change the money supply. And with the interest rate thing, like that's so his argument there is that modern economists like to say, oh well, if we can lower interest rates, that's going to stimulate economic activity. That's obviously like the line that central bankers trot out like ad infinitum. But there's a very simple, but there is a good argument as to why that's just completely wrong. Because as you said, John, like changing the money supply doesn't increase the amount of real resources. All it can do is redistribute the resources. And so if you leave the money supply alone, entrepreneurs who are taking on loans to engage in business activity, sure, they're going to make errors, but they're going to be individual errors that don't have any domino effects. Whereas using the money supply to artificially lower the interest rate creates a cluster of entrepreneurial error. So like in a free system, people save their money. The amount of money that they save determines the amount of money, stored value that is available to invest, and that's what gives the interest rate. That's how the interest rate finds an equilibrium. But if you manipulate the money supply and increase the money supply, you lower the interest rate, and then entrepreneurs, all of a sudden, projects that didn't seem profitable suddenly become profitable because your cost of capital is lowered. So you get a spurt of entrepreneurial activity. People make all these investments. They start engaging in projects, but the real supply of resources hasn't increased. So actually, though they've sort of been tricked. Like those projects can't all be finished. Like if you imagine like the amount of bricks you need to build a building, like everyone starts and lays the foundation, and then halfway through they realize that they actually can't finish the job because there's not enough bricks, there's not enough labor, there's not enough of anything. And so all of a sudden, when that gets found out, you have a bust and a deflationary event. So it's actually the central bank manipulation of the money supply is the cause of the boom and bust cycle, and counter to modern prevailing wisdom, you'd be much better off to just let the interest rate be naturally determined.
Yeah, because, and that's what he says here, is like the interest rate tricks entrepreneurs into thinking there's a certain amount of capital stock when there in fact isn't. So it necessitates that a certain portion of those businesses that get started, that production that's meant to come online, cannot be finished because they've been miscalculated based on a false presumption of how much capital is available to complete those projects. And as you say, when that happens en masse, that means all of a sudden, businesses and production and entrepreneurs everywhere come to realize there's not enough capital stock for this to be completed. And then, they close up shop, they go out of business, whatever. And that creates this massive, effect on the economy. And he says here, the way he articulates it is, what the artificial decrease of the real interest rate does is to increase the number of projects that are launched, but the total volume of investments that can be completed has not thereby increased because this volume depends exclusively on the productive resources that are objectively available during the time needed for completion. And what manipulating the interest rate does is basically tricks people into thinking that there's more resources available than there really are. I would have loved to see him get into the relationship between the capital stock and time preference in setting free market interest rates. I think that would have been some nice context for helping people understand just how disruptive manipulating interest rates is. But, as we said at the beginning, he picked and chose where he spent most of his time, and it could have been an extremely long book if he'd gone into detail in a lot of these things.
Well, what you're talking about there too goes back to that that part from the introduction when we were talking about economics is something following natural laws. There is a natural underlying reality to all of this, and ultimately, if you're just trying to game reality, game the system, you're going to end up in those places where you faked it, and now you can't do it. Now it's going to come to a halt. There's only so much you can game that system.
Which makes it so fucking, it's a wonder any of this shit works at all. Just the level of intervention, but the creation and production of the money, the setting of interest rates, and all the other stuff that goes on. Like it's I guess it's a testament to just human will and determination. And obviously that has limits, and I think we may be approaching them now. But, as you say, Al, this is really simple. Let that natural law kind of unfold. Let the will of each individual actor in an economy dictate, what their productive capacity is and how much capital they bring to the market. And, this finds natural equilibriums that satisfies demands as optimally as they can be satisfied. But all of this intervention does, short-term band-aids, short-term appropriation for whomever, cronies, disaffected people, whatever, but to the detriment of the long-term health of these systems. And I'm constantly astounded at how this fucking thing still functions. And now I think there's a lot of things you could point at to say, well, it ain't functioning that well in many respects. There's a lot of people that have been left out and disenfranchised, and there's a lot of, contentious, or there's a lot of kind of conflict that's brewing as a result of the failures of this system. But that it works at all is still somewhat surprising to me.
A couple quick thoughts. One is I love looking at the interventions through sort of like a Talebian lens or framework, which is basically if you keep on trying to smooth out this volatility, the eventual break or the eventual shock is just so much more. It's such a greater magnitude because you hid that volatility. Not unlike a bunch of funds shorting Bitcoin and making it coil up for a long, long time so we can see another giant green candle about 5 minutes ago and bust through 13K. I know you wanted to talk price on this show. But the other thing is
checking price.
Checking price. No, the other thing while you guys check price that I want to hit is, most of the world really hasn't had the stability from a fiat currency standpoint that the US has, and, probably UK, Switzerland, Canada, whatever, relative stability in the fiat currency. So when people see there's another devaluation of the peso or the Turkish lira or something like that, people there for so many generations throughout the centuries have come to realize how unreliable those fiat currencies are, and they don't hold any of their wealth in fiat anyway. So, you're talking about some tiny versus the net worth of a wealthy family or a wealthy business person in Buenos Aires or Istanbul. If the fiat currency devalues by half or 90% or whatever, you're talking about single digit percentage of their wealth. They don't really care that much. People are just on about their day. They change the prices. They charge their tenants more, and they keep on rolling.
Okay, until you're there.
Kind of, but these are just I'm talking about even, this isn't just the bankers though. This is also grandmas that have apartments and stuff, they kind of
not stupid enough to hold cash, right?
Exactly. They collect apartments. Families collect apartments to rent out. That's basically what they do in these cultures. Or they buy farmland or, whatever it is, or wine or gold or something,
which does still have impacts though, right? One, it pushes them out a little bit on the risk, spectrum in certain cases. But if nothing else, it just means that they're far less liquid. I love the thought, and I guess the current reality, but moving forward into the future even more so, that so many more people are so much more liquid, and that gives, that's freedom. Liquid is optionality, and optionality is freedom, and that everyone's going to have that ability to not, to have an asset that stores a value so well, and obviously, a value accrue to it more than likely in the short to midterm, and that value there's so much you can do with that. I mean, that's, it's great to have real estate that preserves your wealth, but that's stuck in the fucking ground, right? It's not a very liquid asset, but to have something like Bitcoin that has those properties of preservation plus. I mean,
it's amazing, dude. On this, I literally tweeted this morning. I didn't realize it was going to be so relevant, but I tweeted that Biggie and Puff misled us. It's not mo money, more problems. It's actually more fiat, more problems, because you have to put it to work or lose it over time. Like, if you have Bitcoin, your money is not a problem. Like, I don't feel any incremental stress. I feel less and less stress every day the more committed I am to like a personal Bitcoin standard. It doesn't
100%.
change at all. Like my storage solutions that I'm comfortable with are exactly the same. Nothing changed. And, and I don't feel like my fiat's burning a hole in my pocket and I have to go and like buy another apartment to rent out, or figure out some sort of like, quadrant 4 entry point for my Apple stock. I don't need
the old quad 4 makes an appearance.
I just don't need it. I don't need it. I'm like freed from having to watch all the markets all the time. It's just amazing. Like, you can have more money, fewer problems for once.
Well, that's just it. You don't
Breaks
have to
the
be
correlation.
you don't have to be a financial planner to live and be free in the world and make sure that your accrued productivity is not being taken away or not melting away.
All right, who's gonna make the Puff Daddy Corey memes?
Greg's tied up, so.
All right, last thing from my side. He talked about capitalism a bit, and this is just, because it gets so much press these days about, fuck capitalism and all the rest of it. I tweeted this out a few days ago, but I thought it was a really succinct quote that I'll probably share when I get into arguments with the political types. But I'll read it out. He says, the prevailing ways of money production, relying as they do on a panoply of legal privileges, are alien elements in the capitalist economy. They provide illicit incomes, encourage irresponsibility and dependence, stimulate the artificial centralization of political and economic decision-making, and constantly create fundamental economic disequilibria that threaten the life and welfare of millions of people. In short, paper money and fractional reserve banking go a long way toward accounting for the excesses of which the capitalist economy is widely chided. That kind of statement needs to get a broader signal, broader pump.
I hate to sound like the leftists who say real communism has never been tried, but there is a little bit of that there with what is being called capitalism, is crony capitalism or Cantillon capitalism. We're not dealing with a true free market.
Yeah, the central bank is a socialist institution. Like, there's no, it's in Marx. It's like one of the first points in Marx's kind of manifesto. Like, we take over, use a central bank to take over the money. Like, there's nothing in a capitalist. There's nothing in the theory of capitalism that says that money needs to be controlled like that. And I'm reading Graeber's book at the moment, the history of debt, and I think he makes some really good points, but you run into this same problem where he doesn't really know, he doesn't really define capitalism, and like, it's not just the left, like, it's just about everyone who sees the crony capitalism that we have and mistakes that for real capitalism. So yeah, you've got to, and I have that same problem. Well, it's not that Al said, it's not real capitalism. Like, you hate to say that. But yeah, we can't have a discussion unless we properly define our terms. And for none of us, our definition of capitalism would include central banking. In fact, it's antithetical to capitalism.
Totally agree.
It's antithetical to Western ideals.
All right, I'll finish with this part, and then you guys can bring up anything that we haven't touched on. But this is the conclusion of the book, and so the second last paragraph prior to the conclusion, he says, in light of our general discussion of paper money, the answer is patent. All paper money systems, be they national or international, labor under the presence of moral hazard. In the long run, therefore, a global paper money cannot evade the fate of national paper money. It must either collapse in hyperinflation or force the government to adopt a policy of increasing control and eventually total control over all economic resources. Both scenarios entail economic disruptions on a scale that we can barely imagine today. The inevitable result would be death for many hundreds of millions of human beings. Which is not the greatest note to end on, but in the conclusion, he says two things that I'll pick out. One, the point is to return to a universal respect for property rights. And he also says there's no reason why today we should be unable to accomplish such things or something even better. And the preceding lines were just him talking about getting, back to a better standard. And a couple things jump out. One, I mean, we all have probably drummed up the worst case scenario events in our heads where these systems and styles of economic organization and governments lead. And hopefully, as we discussed a little bit before, we can avoid that through Bitcoin. But one of the lines is, the point is to return to a universal respect for property rights. And one of the things that I think is so special about Bitcoin is you don't need people to, I mean, obviously, we hope there's still respect for property rights, and that's certainly something we should strive for in a society. But Bitcoin is de facto property rights, right? You don't need other people to hold them up or enforce them for you. And that's one of the very special things about Bitcoin, is that level of ownership that you can have over it that is so unique to Bitcoin, especially as a monetary or market good. Yeah, that's all. Discuss.
Well, there's an argument that it is the only thing you can truly own, right? I mean, land can be taken from you, your gold can be taken from you, anything else. But if you're willing to die for your private key, they can't take it from you, no matter what.
I mean, I guess the reason why
you got multi-sig, they can't take it from you.
Yeah.
I guess the reason why I brought that up was because, so often the Austrians and the gold bugs and stuff, they and what choice do they have? They hearken back to, hopefully at some point we'll come to our senses, humanity will improve, be more enlightened, whatever, and we can respect this more and we can adhere to this more. And I just think that the point of Bitcoin is that, we can't really rely on humanity or each of our individuals' behavior to be the thing that props up our collective organization and cooperation. It's failed time and time again. It's worked for periods of time, but ultimately it's proven to lead to the same sort of outcomes. And again, that's why I think we're all here in Bitcoin, is that, we wouldn't be here so passionately if it was reliant on just Al being a good guy or all of us coming together and saying, well, it's like the Constitution in the US. I mean, phenomenal document, extremely wise, founders to have put together something like that, but still, just a piece of paper and subject to the imperfections of the humans that decide to hold that up or not hold it up. And, that's what's so, Al, what you were just saying about Bitcoin being maybe the first thing that you could ever own. And again, something that you have that ownership of that has so much optionality. I mean, it's not like an idea or something. It's actually something that you can fully own and protect and also use to facilitate everything else that you want to do in life. And it relies on the cooperation or the let's say the approval of nobody. And, again, freedom, motherfuckers.
Humans are weak. Humans are weak. Every time we have the ability to control the money spigot or the economy, we fuck it up, right? We enslave our brothers and sisters for our own gain. The more power we have, the worse it gets. With Bitcoin, it just takes that control out of your hands. You don't have the option anymore, right? So how much easier does that make society? It removes friction from the economy and society at large.
And all that manipulation that we've been talking about here, about the production of money and the appropriation of value from that money and the setting of, and the illusory nature of most people's impression of how much money there is in the capital stock and everything. I mean, it solves a lot of those problems.
Fixes this.
We we discussed the sovereign individual a couple of months ago on this podcast, and I think that you can bring it back to that, where it is a fundamental technological shift. The information age in general, and Bitcoin in particular, in the favor of free voluntary exchange and the holders of assets. Like you now have a fundamental advantage that you didn't have before because of the unconfiscatable nature of your asset. That is, you holding the private key, and also the liquidity of it, as you said, John. So those two factors give this power to the asset that states can push back against that, but that's out of the bag. Like that can't be changed. So that is a step in the direction of freedom of the individual, freedom of the market, and voluntary exchange. And so that's an undeniably positive thing, I think.
Yeah, and like Greg was saying, it restrains some of the worst aspects of our humanity. But as Dremen just said in the chat, it also puts certain parameters around some of them so that we can actually use them. And I'm sure we've all thought about this before, but greed can be good now because it restrains greed enough, or it keeps it within certain parameters, that now whatever energy is behind that greed, we can kind of squeeze out the good energy of greed and leave out the negative consequences of having it be expressed previously. And of course, there's caveats for all of this, but we're talking general terms about what sort of behavior is both permitted and incentivized in an economy. I mean, I agree with that sentiment that, greed can now be less destructive at the very least.
I got a question for you guys. Do you like Twitter?
Never heard of it.
Oh, do you? I'm just okay. Everybody likes Twitter. Okay, cool.
Love-hate relationship.
Bitcoin is like a 280 character limit on human behavior.
Go on.
That's it. That's
the insight.
But no, I mean, I think what it is like it's. I mean, honestly, that's kind of a summary of the book in some ways. At least some of the things around, what behaviors are induced by rampant, fiat printing, and what that does to culture and society and priorities and choices of families and individuals and companies, et cetera, et cetera. Like, this invention, which was forecast by many, but I think ended up being probably better than the forecasts as far as like what digital cash was, what the properties were that were chosen for Bitcoin, which we have, I think, are better than most people's forecasts of what eCash would be, and more meaningful and more impactful on society than what we thought eCash could be. Rewrites the playbook. It basically settles once and for all, 50 to 90% of the arguments that freshman philosophy students have late at night in their liberal arts campuses. It's like, no, that's just wrong. Like, we don't really have to talk about that anymore. Your views are wrong, because Bitcoin is, and that's reality. And now everything has to align with that reality. And from this day forward, that's how we will all sort of see things, because those are the facts on the ground and they're indisputable. So yeah, I think it's like the constraints of 21 million unleash this creativity, because you're working within a framework that's much more, well, it is the framework now, and we will all be on the same playing field, and, sort of thinking about at least those things affected by having sound money. We'll be thinking about those things in the same way, and that's almost everything.
Yeah. It's like we were saying about the financialization of everything, how it's taken up so much time and resources just to manage your wealth. And now Bitcoin has reversed that trend. I think we'll see that come to so many different things, where Bitcoin kind of dissolves away your need to dwell or grapple with things even internally, and frees up your, the whole Bitcoin Zen sort of thesis, where, you're relieved of the worry or the attention required for, I think we'll find out, a lot of different things, and you can then focus that energy and attention on, providing value to the market and things that, are meaningful to you and that sort of thing. But I think a lot dissolves away as a result of Bitcoin being kind of the dominant paradigm.
John, if you wouldn't mind, I found the greatest Bitcoin fixes this quote ever, I think, while I was reading this. And it really ties a lot of this together. What Greg was saying about every time you give control to humans, about building systems that are not susceptible to human nature, about the Catholic philosophy. But I'll read this real quick. I think this is the greatest Bitcoin fixes of all time.
Excited.
It says, thus, counterfeiting exists in all types of economies, be it the market of a free society or that of a centrally planned economy of a totalitarian state. Unlike fiat money, of which we will speak below, it cannot be abolished through political measures. It can be repressed by the prospect of such external means, or of severe punishment, but it cannot be entirely eliminated by such external means because it springs from the internal human condition of original sin. In preventing counterfeiting, Bitcoin fixes original sin. That is the biggest Bitcoin fix I've ever come upon. And it is only a little piece of the idea, but it really
that would be great to explore.
Yeah,
we should actually dig into that sometime.
we need to get you need to get Bitcoin Rabbi and then find a Catholic priest who's into Bitcoin, get them on, and
I'll call Jordan Peterson and get him to hop on.
That's true.
Then,
that'd be amazing.
We can have a chat about it.
If you could get him on, I would pay a few sats to see that.
Yeah, you and me both. Well, gents, that's all I got. Anybody else have any closing thoughts or things they wanted to get in before we shut this thing down?
Yeah, I think everybody is undervaluing Bitcoin. Everybody.
Agreed.
I think nobody has, at least that I've seen, come up with an explanation of what absolute scarcity is going to mean for how economies function in the future. And I think it's going to be an explosion of productivity in line with the explosion of mathematics after the discovery or the invention of the number zero. I mean, I think every projection I've seen about adoption S curves and valuations, they're all too low. They don't make any sense.
Did you guys,
completely different,
at the risk of opening up a can of worms, did you guys see any of the back and forth between Breedlove and Voskuhl about the concept of economic scarcity the other day?
No.
Yeah, I did. I found that really interesting because I think Eric's makes a good point. And I've heard him, he's a thorn in the side of a lot of different people. And as annoying as he is, like he usually has a good point, even if it's just a definitional, issue. But I think Voskuhl attacks like a really fundamental belief in Bitcoin, which is, forget the actual stock to flow price prediction model, but he attacks just the concept of stock to flow as a concept. Like he doesn't think that has any validity.
I don't know why they just didn't settle on that. The production, like new production, is unresponsive to demand. Like I
agree. It's really just a definitional.
It's
just about picking a term and defining your term. I agree. It could have been sold. If scarcity in the economic sense, to sum up what was discussed, Robert and I think all of us talk about scarcity in a relative sense, and we say, gold is more scarce than silver, and Bitcoin is potentially more scarce than gold. But Eric's saying, no, that's a misuse of the term. Scarcity is binary. So a thing is scarce or not scarce. It can't be more or less scarce. And scarce in the sense of, can it be monetized? Can it be an economic good? Like air, oxygen is not a scarce good because you can't have a money value, but anything else, bananas, houses, gold is scarce because it can be monetized, and you can only be relatively scarce to your. This is a bit hard to understand. Relative to itself as a function of price. We talk about scarcity and stock to flow ratios influencing price, whereas he says it's the other way around. Like price, that is the intersection of supply and demand, is what creates the relative scarcity. It's a bit of even for me, it's a mind bend.
I love how Eric, in his way of articulating and thinking about things, he does put pressure on you to clarify your thinking, but he's never going to be the type to be on a dialogue with you and say like, oh, I see what you're trying to say there. Like, he won't give you that. Oh, yeah. He's going to, it has to be by the book. Every articulation you make has to be like, he's not going to give you any leeway. You're going to have to go all the way there and make it work. He's not going to help you out.
He is a stickler when it comes to definitions too. I mean, he loves to invoke definitions and wordplay, but he's I met him once, and he's one of those people that you start talking to and you're like, wow, I don't feel very smart right now. Like, he's super brilliant, but I would hate to get in an argument with him because he can be pedantic, and yeah.
There are a lot of master debaters on Bitcoin Twitter. It definitely makes you stay sharp and put out crisp, clean sentences that don't contain ambiguity. And then if somebody really wants to win a point, they'll still twist what you said. But that's when you can just leave the thread.
Yeah.
Toxic community.
Anybody else? Closing thoughts on the book or anything else?
No, I'm all jacked up from learning from you guys. I'm literally about to get on the phone with a Seattle restaurateur who owns a ridiculous number of restaurants in the Northwest. And he's a friend of my brother's, and he finally said he wanted to have the Bitcoin chat.
Nice.
Sorry, I wasn't able to get him on the phone last week because I know it's going to be successful and could have gotten him in at like 10-5 or 11 or something, but whatever.
Lots of upside to come.
Exactly. All sats under 100K are cheap sats.
Yeah, exactly. All right, gents. Well, look, thanks for coming on and having a chat about this book. I know for some it's not the most exciting material, but it does form the basis for a lot of the ideas, concepts, and understanding that we often talk about in this space. So I think, I hope at least, some people that maybe haven't read it or haven't talked about this shit before, it'll bring some value to them. And it's always fun talking with you guys. So thanks for joining, and we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was great.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
See you guys.
John.